Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Yorkshire and Humber IIRSM branch meeting this afternoon. We are very fortunate and very lucky to have one of our own committee members joining us today to share his experience of being a neurodivergent professional. Works as the Director of Safety, Health and Wellbeing at the University of York, and he is here today to talk to us about the enablers and blockers for neurodivergent colleagues in a neurotypical world. We will be taking questions in the chat throughout, so please do pop them there, and then we'll be able to have a look at those, go through some of those once we get to the end of this session. Thank you very much, and I'll hand you over to Zev.
Thank you, Heather. Good afternoon, everyone. As Heather mentioned, I'm just going to try and focus on enablers and blockers for neurodivergent colleagues in a neurotypical world, and the focus would be my personal experiences. So before I kind of go ahead, I'll tell you a little bit about myself, about my conditions. When I was quite young, I was diagnosed with dyslexia and dyspraxia. And I grew up back home in India, and at the time, I think these diagnoses for these conditions existed, but I don't think people truly understood, or even the doctors and specialists truly understood what it actually means to support someone with dyslexia and dyspraxia. So as a result, I don't think I ever got the support I needed. And growing up in a family with quite a few sisters and things, it was difficult and complicated, and I did struggle throughout my journey with the schools. When I moved to the UK for my higher education, the struggle continued. And one of the things that I could never sort of make peace with was, why is it me? Felt like I was always sort of the chosen one to struggle and find it difficult. Um, then, while I was in the university, I met my now wife, the then partner, and she's been picking up some of those cues for a long time, and she has been sort of nagging me for quite a few years ever since I met her, and that's dating about 18 years ago, about getting some sort of diagnosis looked at to see if I need further support regarding my dyslexia. I think symptoms of dyslexia kind of became subtle in time because as I grew up, but dyslexia was getting worse. And I suppose I was in sort of a denial because I'm almost now at the time 22 years old, and it's like I've never had help, so why should I bother now? But the journey of struggle continued. Um, the breaking point for me was during the COVID time, because obviously before COVID, we were all working 4 days, 5 days a week. We had a busy life, and suddenly everything was shut down during COVID. And that's when I really was struggling in day-to-day life, personally, professionally. And that's when my wife was like, no, you need to get some diagnosis. And we did some research. And then I did something, read about different conditions, neurodiversity and things. And I opted, my symptoms, taking a few online questionnaires, were matching with autism. So looking at the GP and the NHS system at the time, it was a lot of wait. So I went private and I got autism spectrum diagnosis. Um, and I was like, oh, that's great. That would really be useful because now I can get the right support. The years I've been struggling, I know what I need to do. That didn't pan out as I expected. In fact, actually, it made things worse for me. And so bad that I was diagnosed with depression, and I am on medication since last 3 years. Um, Now, truth be told, I think the diagnosis of depression helped me more than the diagnosis of my autism, because since I'm on medication, it has calmed my brain down. On the flip side, though, it has elevated my ADHD symptoms. So there is no win-win situation. But anyhow, that was a bit of a story about me. But on in this sort of over the years, I've learned to navigate certain relationships, work around the conditions and challenges that a neurodivergent person with ADHD, OCD, dyslexia, autism would suffer. Um, and and me sort of learning from practical experiences, have put together a few sort of guidelines which I will share in my presentation that have worked for me, and I thought it'd be useful to share around with my colleagues and peers, and others alike. So, moving on to the next slide to start off, I thought I'll give a quick overview around autism, which would be the focus of my presentation. So, when we talk about globally, approximately 15 to 20% of the population in the world is estimated to exhibit some sort of neurodivergence, and that is around 5 employees in an organization. In the UK itself, it is approximated that about 20% of the population is neurodivergent. Now, I know there's a few people around the world lately, especially in the US world, had been making some claims in public around autism. But when we look at the stats for US itself, the unemployment rate for the neurodivergent adults is 8 times the average rate, which is around 30 to 40%. And that's based on University of Connecticut Center for Neurodiversity and Employment Innovation. Now, when we look into the UK, according to the National Autistic Society, only 22% of autistic adults are in paid employment. That includes full-time, part-time, or any sort of employment. And it's a shame because it's now research backed that autistic individuals exhibit excellent cognitive abilities when it comes to concentration, accuracy, analysis, memory, skills that are usually widely valued at senior level. Now, as I said in my talk, I'll touch upon a little bit more about my experiences, some of the strategies that have helped me, coping mechanism. Uh, and this is kind of mixed pre-diagnosis and post-diagnosis for what it's worth. I think post-diagnosis, I've just been able to finesse it and officially get support at work. So, just a quick one. What's neurodivergence? It's a term for when someone's brain processes, learns, or behaves in a different way, uh, in a non-typical way. The way I like to call it, and that's just my personal sort of term for myself, is my brain is wired differently. I'm not the usual type. Now, I won't go into the details, but I've just picked a few examples of neurodivergence, which is autism spectrum disorder, attention deficiency hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and Tourette syndrome. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, and there are quite a few. And lately, a lot of research is being dedicated towards neurodiversity, which is a positive step. Um, but I think it's just the start, and there is a long journey ahead of us. I wanted to touch base a little bit more around the statistics regarding autism and neurodivergence in the UK. Now, when we're looking at autism, if we compare from 2009 to 2019 in the UK, in 2009, there were less than 50% local authorities that offered adult autism assessment services, compared to in 2019, which was increased to 92%, 93%, which allowed greater access to assessments. Now, when we talk about autism diagnostic and statistic manual, that actually did not enter any sort of formal proceedings until 1980, and that too as infantile autism. So basically, whatever we know of autism is based on a very narrow population of cisgender white male participants, and which further means that people such as autistic girls, autistic women, people from ethnic backgrounds, people in low and medium economies, and multi-marginalized autistic people have historically been underdiagnosed, not diagnosed, or been ignored. Um, and in a way, if you think about it, if you look at the sort of whole wider population, autistic people are still playing catch up because they have been missed and they're slowly being recognized. And some of the people may have had such poor experiences that they still prefer to live in isolation than actually come out and seek diagnosis. Um, Now, from my perspective, it doesn't matter who's claiming what about autism. I think it's a good thing that neurodiversity is being recognized. They're starting to get the attention it always deserved. Um, and for autistic people who have not had support and recognition, are now starting to get the support they need and deserve. So coming back to some of the statistics, around 1 in 7 people in the UK are neurodivergent, and a third of the employees say their experiences at work in relation to the neurodiversity has been negative and has further deteriorated their mental health and well-being. Uh, when we look at the employment rate and disparities, the latest employment figures show that there's a significant gap between neurodivergent individuals with the employment rate for disabled people with autism at 31% compared to 54.7 for all disabled people. And that's almost around 25% difference. And as we say, not all disabilities are hidden. I think this is a clear example that perhaps we are not there yet to say or truly practically imply that all disabilities um, are to be supported as equal. It seems like there isn't. There is a big difference. Now, I mentioned about the autistic people in employment in my previous slide, which was about 22%. Now, if I talk about just the full-time employment, there's only 16%. That's even further 6% drop of autistic adults in employment, and that's not great. Even if I go with the original autistic statistic since 1980, we're now almost 56 years from there, and the amount of autistic people in full-time paid employment is 16%. That tells you that what a large journey we have to accomplish, and how we need to move forward, or what we need further we need to improve. Now, when it comes to lack of awareness and managerial confidence, ACAS did some research and highlighted that and as part of the research, they highlighted that 45% of line managers lacked organizational knowledge about neurodiversity, with 59% not knowing how to make reasonable adjustments. Now, this is an interesting stat because often we rely on line managers to support the employees or direct reports. But from my perspective, it's sometimes even the line managers don't have the right skills or understanding, which that the previous stat about 45%. And I think there is a gap in employers taking the ownership and making sure they're providing the right tools, the right guidances, right guidelines to the people who have line management responsibilities to ensure they can offer the right support to their reports, direct reports on all employees. Um, there was an ACAS survey of almost 1,700 line managers that identified that 72% reported employees not disclosing need for reasonable adjustments as a major barrier. And I can speak for myself as well. Even though there was no sort of legal requirement to show my official diagnosis report, I knew I had some medical condition. I knew I was diagnosed with dyslexia. Still, I was I was very uncomfortable sharing and requesting for reasonable adjustments. Sure, the diagnosis of autism and depression has made some changes, and I feel more confident about requesting for reasonable adjustments. But often I think, is it because I've become confident because of those further diagnosis, or is it because the world as I knew has changed and um, is more receptive to people like myself, and even though I might not get the right level of support, at least there is more encouragement, and that's what helped me build the confidence. Um, and just to finish off that slide, about 45% of that line managers identified that there was a lack of organizational knowledge as well. So as I said, it's not just the employees or the line managers, it's the organization as a whole. So moving on to the slide, I'll start off by sharing some of my blockers at my workplace. So one of the things that I've always struggled with is the inaccessible recruitment processes, the retainment policies, and promotion and progression practices. I think they are not just a blocker to someone with autism, but all neurodiverse conditions with all disabilities. I think despite being Equality Act in motion since what almost 2 decades, I still think employers are far behind making it a bit more a more equal and diverse workplace. I personally struggled. There are so many adverts that I can count on my fingertips that I knew I'm qualified for, but I just didn't apply because the recruitment process itself, the terminology they used in the post was so off-putting that I didn't even looked at anything else and I didn't apply. There's a few jobs which I was invited to interview, and it's in fact recently as well, in the last couple of years. And when I requested for my reasonable adjustments, they tried to negotiate, and that was again a turning point and a blocker for me. And I politely refused, and I said, "Sorry, I would prefer to withdraw my application because I'm not even actually started a job or taking the job, and the negotiations have started." And which was funny, but and it happens. I'm sure it has happened to other people. Um, Hiding. So this I've talked about. I'm talking more about workplace, but this kind of goes around my personal life as well. That by default, majority of the neurodiverse uh, people, in order to try to fit in the neurotypical world, they by default learn to mask, which becomes a barrier and a pattern. So in a day-to-day life, taking myself, I can have decent conversation with people. I can engage on topic that interest me, but that would just drain me out completely when I come home. And what I'm trying to do now is constantly fight that barrier. I can, I mean, there's so many people who have turned down, come on to me and say, "Oh, are you sure you're autistic? You didn't look like autistic. Oh, are you sure you're dyslexia? You seem to be reading the emails and responding back appropriately." Yeah, because I've got 25, 30 years of experience. I've had these blockers since can remember, and I've worked on them. I use a lot of softwares. I use a lot of skills. I've developed, I've developed so many strategies. Um, and it's a day-to-day challenge. When I read an email, I have to read it 10 times. When I reply back to an email, I have to read it 10 times. That's an extra toll on me. But obviously, all of those things I cannot share. And the people on the other side, they don't see that either as well. So, but even today, people, I can see in their eyes that they get shocked a little bit when they come to know about my condition. And again, I speak for myself, but I'm sure that this is the same experiences that others will have as well. Training, coaching, and mentoring. Now, this is a funny one because there is a lot of budget allocated for staff training, development, coaching, and mentoring, both in private and public sector for the employees. But from my perspective, I find them to be useless, if I'm being honest, because all of those training courses, or at least majority of them that I've taken, have been quite generic and fit for neurotypical people or neurotypical world. And from my perspective, I need something more specific. Now, I used to do therapy a few years ago, and it's funny because the way these therapies work is they say that they are tailor made. I went in because of my conditions. They're tailor made and they would be specific to individual need. And I was quite honest and opinion upfront about my requirements. Yet, the techniques that were used by the therapists were more around what's your problem and how would you solve the problem. Well, and that's a concern for me because the only reason why I'm looking to I'm resorting to therapy and support and advice is because I don't know what to do. And I'm looking for sort of some suggestions and solution. But in my mind, if I have to go to a therapist or to a colleague and lay out my problem and then them talking me through finding a solution, then why would I spend time doing that? I would rather just shut myself in a room for a few hours and then come up with some solution by myself. They might not work, but at least it'll be less exhaustive for me personally than actually spending some money over therapists or spending time with colleagues. But I hear that it's changing. There's a lot more coaching and mentoring that are truly now custom built. I haven't personally tried it, but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to, through my network channels, coach and mentor colleagues as well, junior colleagues, and then I kind of try and use the techniques that I would like to get mentorship in. So yeah, that's been a blocker for me. And then the last one, I think one of the major ones was empathy. Now, I've obviously I've talked about the challenge of the neurodiversity, but also the neurodiversity becomes worse when it meets with ethnic minorities such as myself or ethnic backgrounds such as myself. Now, I grew up in India. I've been in overseas in the UK for almost more than half my life, but on a day-to-day basis, I can tell that my challenges of being a neurodivergent person is perceived as cultural difference or lack of understanding or lack of or grasp of English language, which isn't true. Um, and there's also systemic disparities in understanding how, in practice, to support neurodivergence at workplace. So there is that challenge as well that someone like myself under my within the same sort of bracket as myself would face as well. So these are some key blockers for me. My enablers, so it's taken me almost 20 years of my practical lesson learned to put these in place. What I would say is obviously these have worked for me. They might not work for others, but I'm just putting it out there. And what I always say is that if you look at the list of mine that I put together, it's not an exhaustive list. It's not something that costs a lot of money. They're quite reasonable. And from my perspective, this is something that can be offered to all employees. So we are not segregating the neurotypical versus the neurodivergent people or disabled people. Work environment, I prefer a designated office space, quiet areas, adjustable lighting. But I've had some experiences working in hybrid ways of working, multi-purpose floors, open space plans. Now, I'm not overly fond of those. But and I don't think I can work for an entire day, 4 days, 5 days a week, continuously in that space. But I can do a few hours in a day. I can do a couple of days in that sort of space. And the rest of the days I can either work from home or I can book some sort of a single office space on site, or I can work from a cafe with my headphones on. But that's how I find the balance. But when I could in my previous roles, I preferred a designated space office. Noise cancelling headphones, good quality ones, is pretty good for me. It's very useful both in my personal and professional life. I've put here loud music is because this came about over a few years ago when I was really struggling and I wasn't finding time to process and reflect. I used to go out for running and I somehow stumbled upon listening to some loud music. Is like really deathcore music, like hardcore music, and that certainly helped me process things quicker and faster, and they were a lot clearer. So in time, I started to try it while I was working. So when I'm working and focusing on certain things, I would have that loud music in the background, noise cancelling headphones, and somehow that would improve my productivity. So I've kind of stuck to that as well. Flexibility and autonomy to manage my working arrangements is also quite quite useful. So the way my clock works, and I'm sure it's the same for other autistic people or with other neurodiverse conditions, individuals with neurodiverse conditions as well, that it's very important that they have flexibility to work. Our clocks work very differently. Not one day is similar. Every day is different. Today, if I'm up at 5 o'clock, I'm very good to work for like good 2 to 3 hours, 5 hours, or even the entire day. Excuse me. Tomorrow I might not be, and then I will struggle. So having that flexibility and autonomy is quite important. What I would say is, and I'm sure again, my other neurodiverse colleagues will relate to this, is that we are very, our work ethics are extremely strong. So we do make up our work and hours. In fact, actually, we do make up more than I would say some of our neurotypical colleagues, and I would leave it at that. Assisted technology, there's a lot more assisted technology than it used to be. Um, I've got a preference of certain technology, like I prefer to use Apple iPhone, I prefer to use MacBook. No specific reason. I've been using it for the last 15, 16 years, ever since, or 20 years, ever since my college days, and I've stuck to it. And now changing it is going to be quite excruciating for me. So I've stuck with that. My workplace at the moment is happy to provide me those. If not, in the past, I've purchased from my own personal pocket and then use it for work. So, but yeah, so but these are certain things that I prefer, and I'm not quite comfortable budging. I'm sure there are colleagues who might not be in the same sort of privilege that I am. And this is where I'll talk a bit about my, in my other slides, why it's important for the employers to truly understand the supportive and reasonable needs of neurodiverse colleagues. Communication is important, that the communication is quite clear, and most importantly is unambiguous. They're quite, the instructions are clear. They're not talking in sort of double meaning words. And it's more professional rather than more sarcasm based, if that makes sense. Um, it's important for me to sort of build trust and have the psychological safety. Otherwise, I can't trust the person. And if I can't trust the person, there's always that gap in between communicating with colleagues at work. Um, Processes and leadership. So I'm now in a fortunate position where I can not change things within my organization, but I can influence certain procedures. And what I'm trying to do is support the recruitment and selection processes. um, so one of the things which I won't talk in detail is I'm trying to encourage our HR team is to start thinking about making our processes truly inclusive, not just uh, for neurotypical people, but also for neurodiverse people, for disabilities, and everyone alike. And rather than a neurotypical person writing all those processes, get some people with real life experiences to support with them and make a difference. Um, and the other thing that's helping me personally is also being an advocate myself and promoting neurodiversity openly. So I do every now and then when I get time, put up some articles through my LinkedIn channel, through my these engagements, networks. Um, and that also helps me actively break out of my masking patterns. Um, how to embrace neurodiversity in workplace. So as I said, the employers, the organization need to focus more on inclusive recruitment. Um, and when I say inclusive, it shouldn't come under as a disability or neurotypical or this or that. I think it should be just point blank inclusive. So it doesn't matter who the employer is or the end user, it should work for every person. Improving organizational understanding of neurodiversity. I think there's a big gap between what how and what to support neurodiverse people with, and what the senior leaders think it is. Um, it's interesting, and I don't want to divert the topic, but is something as an example of, stress at work where, people don't understand it. It doesn't mean that the employees aren't struggling with it. But I think there's a big disconnect, and neurodiversity is is no different to that as well. I think there's a big disconnect between what happens on the ground and what the key decision makers think it is. Creating and maintaining enabling backgrounds, environments, targeted organizational change, and training. So I think there should be some sort of targeted programs that would support neurodiversity. I'll give you a quick example. A few years ago, and this is pre my diagnosis. I was in Edinburgh on the Princess Street with my wife, and then went to Starbucks for a coffee, and I noticed that they had employed two individuals who had Down syndrome. Now, that was really touching for me, and I was really sort of inspired seeing that. But more so, I was extremely chuffed knowing that Starbucks had some sort of program to put people with Down syndrome in employment, and that has stayed for me since then. And this must be about 15 years, maybe or more, around the time. And from that day onwards till date, my preferred place for coffee is Starbucks. That one experience of mine made me their loyal customer. Now that probably on a large scheme doesn't make any difference to Starbucks, but it does to me, and I think that was good. Um, so yeah. So and I think that's something that organizations can do as well. Have targeted approach to certain training programs, and really make a difference. This is some of the few benefits of having neurodiversity in the workplace. As I was saying, autistic people are very um, analytical, and when you're looking at having an inclusive, neurodiverse workplace, you're promoting innovation and creativity. You're promoting new ways to solve problems. You're strengthening the technical and creative design teams. There's a strong recall of information and detailed factual knowledge, which means the decision making would be based on facts rather than judgments. Um, Neurodiverse people are extremely reliable, they're very loyal, and they're also persistent. And I think that's how you become a truly diverse workplace. These are some examples of how excellent or what sort of professions neurodiverse people excel in. So they're excellent auditors, engineers, regulators, um, they're researchers. In my wife always says that in academia, people with autistic are like liquid, are like gold, as if they've hit a gold mine or something, because they're highly in demand. They're excellent accountants as well. So, and these are just a few examples. I think I know a few leaders in higher education and other private sector where the leaders are dyslexic, they're autistic, and they're excellent leaders. They're really great. And so it's not like that they don't know what to do or they can't operate. It's just they need the right opportunities, right support at the right time so that they can use their full potential. This is just before I sum up my presentation, just some food for thought for my viewers today, attendees. So it's always good to review recruitment processes, job advertisements. As I said earlier on, when I read through so many job descriptions, feel turned up and I don't even apply because of the terminology. Train and support managers, targeted training mechanisms, raising awareness, offer support to all employees. So that's another way. So rather than isolating disabled people or neurodiverse people, it's good to offer flexibility and better working arrangements to all employees. So people like myself don't feel awkward and uncomfortable when we're requesting for support. Have a targeted developed neurodiversity policy. Now, at the bottom, I put two questions, and I think that's something perhaps you guys can take away as well. like what I always ask myself, what can I do practically as a health and safety specialist to support my neurodiverse colleagues? Personally, I am trying to offer I'm volunteering as a coach and a mentor, both at my workplace and through other programs as well. I'm promoting neurodiversity through LinkedIn. So that's something I'm trying to make a difference. And you can yourself ask as well something similar. What can you do within your roles to support neurodiversity? And as within my organization, what can I help to improve infrastructure and systems? So I've changed, so I can't change the the whole of university's recruitment process, but what I can do is change my departmental processes, the way I do the interview and selection processes, the terminologies that I use can be slightly more inclusive. Um, I've been recruiting, I've done quite a few recruitments over the last 3 to 5 years. And personally, I feel that I'm making some minor changes. These are just some references that I've used for my presentation, and I think that is me. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Zev. And I think I speak for everyone when I say we really appreciate you sharing your journey and your experiences as well in the workplace. It was very much appreciated. Looking, just listening to some of the things you were saying there, we had a few comments in the chat. And I think when you were saying, you said, people often will say, well, you don't look autistic, or, you don't sound autistic. And I think myself and Richard in the chat as well, I think we recognise that as very common. I think that we do hear that quite often. I don't know what people are expecting. But I think as more education comes about, then people might start to understand things such as masking, which is truly exhausting. Richard also says in the chat that at Ground Control Limited, we have neurodiversity champions and a network which he implemented. They also utilise the ATW scheme, but that does require constant education around the first 6-week rule and the first £1,000. I might need some further education on that. As a grant is useful for the neurodiversity coaching, the self and the team coaching, and other adaptive software as well. So it sounds like Richard's been going through a bit of a journey in his workplace with the neurodiversity. You talked as well about the environment that we're within. And I did post in the chat as well. I did post a link to a PAS document, PAS 6463, which is all about designing a workplace for neurodiversity. And I work with a lot of architects, but I don't yet see that really being implemented as yet, which is a shame. I keep telling everybody about this guidance that is available. And I think also just picking up there as well, when you were talking about things such as, I recognise a lot of your enablers when you were going through some of those. When we talk about neurodiversity in the workplace, and we're starting to see a little bit of education, and we're starting to see some more organisations have neurodiversity policies, for example. Do you think that's been driven by people who are neurodivergent in the workplace, who are maybe in those leadership roles, and they're actually saying, look, we need to do this education and we are pushing it? Do you think, because I know you said the world is changing, the world is being more receptive, and I was wondering whether that is because there's more leaders, more managers that do recognize themselves as being neurodivergent, or is it that people are going through training and they're raising it themselves? What's your thoughts on that?
Yes, that's an interesting question. So I think my personal views are is more there's more awareness, there's more recognition because um, there's a lot more social channels where people can come out where they don't have to identify themselves. And I think there's a lot more research in those areas. It's been there for a few years, but because of the availability of these additional social networks, I think that research is now getting the public views. And then through those, the day-to-day people like yourselves and myself are able to relate to that. And that's influencing workforce. It's influencing parents, and becoming more confident. They're starting to identify the patterns or cues in behaviors and seeking out more diagnosis. And I think it's so, I don't think, to answer your question, I don't think it's one point or the other. I think it's a mix.
Yeah.
But I think what I would say is senior leaders are for sure in those roles, whether they've identified themselves or not, are also supporting as well. I think they're trying their best as well.
Yeah, I think I see that. I see that more and more when I'm going into organizations. And I think in my role, I'm a safety professional, as are you. Where do you think the policy perhaps sits? It's one of those that sometimes HR will take full ownership of it and safety gets consulted. But I know numerous clients, have spoken to me and said, can you, help us write a neurodiversity policy as a safety professional? It seems to be one of those, hallway drawers where everything's thrown together, the safety and the HR. Where do you think it sits?
I think from my perspective, I think it should still sit within HR umbrella because they are the ones who are, let's say, owners of the organizational policies. But I think when it comes to developing those policies or reviewing those policies and maybe even promoting those policies, I think it needs to be a more collaborative joint approach between different stakeholders. And health and safety by default probably would be one of the biggest stakeholder because of the Health and Safety Welfare Act, so it kind of aligns not just with health and safety, but also the welfare facilities.
Mm.
And these days, I think that welfare is changing into well-being
Yeah.
as well. So, but I don't think so. From my perspective, if my organization asks me to write a policy or develop a policy, I'm more than happy to support them. But I don't think I'll be comfortable to take the ownership of it because it needs to be a central university policy and it needs to be a human resources policy.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much where it should be. We should have that, and especially again, safety, that crossover. You talked in general how neurodiverse we should be talking in plain and unambiguous language and not having words with double meanings and keeping things, straightforward. And I think that should be in safety anyway, shouldn't it? So we should have that whether somebody is neurodivergent or not. So I think that does make sense to have that HR ownership and then the safety buy-in. Like I say, they often are joining up as one. Just have we got any further questions that anybody wants to pop into the chat? I'm just having a look through to the chat over there. Just bear with me and I'll just have a quick, because I was writing down so many things. I think I've just sort of already regurgitated most of them. Okay, so common experience, yeah, and I think I've covered quite a lot of the things I was going to talk about. I think as well, with these education programs and with people becoming more aware of it and with us having more of the social channels as well, I was thinking a little bit about, when you said women and girls are often underdiagnosed, and quite often their symptoms are maybe exaggerated by hormone fluctuations. So going through in the teens or going through midlife when we've got perimenopause and menopause. And it's often at those points when they're going through this huge hormonal development change anyway, that's when a lot of the symptoms become even more visible or more apparent, and it's harder to mask in some of those situations. And I think you did mention that, and I think people being more aware of where as well of stimming. So, it's something that is a language word we're probably quite familiar with, stimming, whereas other people that may be neurotypical might not be quite familiar with that term. Do you want to explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think I'll tell you, and I'm guilty as charged as well in this one. So being a neurodiverse person myself, but if I talk about before I got my diagnosis and things, and I had other diagnoses, and I knew that how I've been struggling, and there are other people, like I've come from a family of, so I've got three elder sisters, each stronger than other, all of those things. So, but somehow, and then I was also kind of aware of how women struggle more as I've seen growing up as well in general. But But when I compare myself, and this is something that it was an eye opener to my wife, and that's why I said guilty as charged. So we were talking about something, and then my wife said, "Oh, looks like that lady could be autistic." And I'm like, "No, because she doesn't have the symptoms that I have." And then she's like, "Well, she doesn't have to." I thought, "Oh yeah, sorry." But it's kind of an eye opener for me as well in a way,
Yeah.
because I knew all of those things. Being an autistic person myself, still I couldn't, you know. Um, Put that in practice. And if we talk about that again with the neurotypical world, and we talk about like girls and women, it's so easy to dismiss their concerns and not take them seriously. And unfortunately, there is still that disparity between men and women. And, I know so many people women itself, who had their entire journey of life. They've gone through motherhood and they worked, and still they struggle, and they're trying to seek. And it's in a way it's very inspiring, because I take inspiration from whatever I can. But I do think there is a lot more work that needs to be done, and hopefully. So I was talking to someone earlier on. A couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about perhaps there needs to be a lot more targeted research in those areas as well, areas that have been underlooked or overlooked in the past. Um, but yeah, I think it's perhaps something that needs to change, and I think it will change. How soon, I don't know, but it should be quicker than it should needs to be.
It seems to be on a bit of a momentum at the moment, doesn't
Yeah,
it? It seems to be, as long as we don't keep getting these random news stories coming from the other side of the world.
yeah.
So that
It
doesn't
has
help any.
changed. The focus has changed for now.
Yeah. James in the chat says, should neurodivergence be included in a risk assessment in the same way that fatigue is factored in, especially where we are looking at safety critical environments? What's your take on that, Ev?
I think it would depend. If you're looking at an individual risk assessment, then I would say probably yes, and they should have that. But I think in terms of a general risk assessment, it needs to be a lot perhaps more discrete to avoid any identification or clear cues, because there could be these teams or even organizations where you only have one or two people with neurodiverse conditions, and we wouldn't want them to feel isolated or feel awkward and be easily identifiable. um, so to give an example, a lot of the employers, like in my current university, we have this reasonable adjustment plan, which is more like a risk assessment as well, but it's between the individual and the line manager, and HR, and is based on obviously individual requirements, occupational health assessments, any diagnosis report, and it's a live document that they use. Now, that could, depending on individual, they can share some information with their colleagues, with the direct reports like I have. I've been quite open because it helps me support them and them support me. So that might be allowed, but I would perhaps say I probably wouldn't be in a favor of having like a generic risk assessment unless it's very generic and not specific.
Yeah. I think as well, when I mean looking thinking back to your slide and you said people who, are autistic or neurodivergent excel in these particular areas. So we had things like, very focused activities in there. We had engineering and we had auditing and you also had creative arts. It was very diverse, it was very varied. And I think when you are sort of in that environment and you maybe are neurodivergent, it's going to work both ways. If you're ADHD and you've got a hyper focus going on, they're probably the best person to have in a safety critical environment at that time. But so at the other extreme, your days fluctuate. So you might be having a day where actually it is a bit harder to focus. But as an individual, then you're not necessarily going to be able to predict when those days are. So the risk assessment, like say, it can be a bit of a tricky thing to nail down, but certainly an interesting discussion point. Richard is echoing, I think, what we're all thinking, and he's saying thank you for being so open and honest, especially as a senior leader. And yeah, I think that just echoes what we're all thinking and what we're all want to say to you. Um, I haven't got, oh yeah, we've got James is saying, very interesting. It's difficult to balance between open and honest conversations and people's right to privacy. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely right there. That is again, a bit of a balancing act. Some people want to, they want to mass, they don't want to share. And again, we just as leaders have to be conscious of people's strengths and weaknesses as we would be anyway, whether they were
Mhm.
neurodivergent or not. But how can we support?
And I think this is where it comes, where if you make the workplace supportive for all employees, so
Yeah,
the ones who are not neurotypical don't feel that their privacy has been invaded. So yeah, as James rightly said, people right to privacy. So I think if we
yeah,
offer certain adjustments, reasonable adjustments, and things, or access to assistive technology, then I think some of the individuals who would want that additional support will not have the need to actually disclose anything.
yeah. And it's finding that again, and it's working with your
Yeah,
HR teams to develop that
yeah,
neurodiversity policy and seeing what reasonable adjustments could be made in your working environment. I think Richard, very, very good having that neurodivergent champions and that network where they can share and they can put things into practice. So that's really good practice to see there as well. Um, I'd just like to, again, thank you. I can't thank you enough there.
yeah.
I'm just going to say
Thanks.
again, thank you for your time today and sharing your experiences. I don't have any more questions coming through on the chat at the moment, but I think it's been a very interesting discussion. And you know me, I could keep talking about it for hours. But I appreciate everybody's having their lunch break and joining us for this session today. So thank you very much. We're going to close the session there. And I look forward to your next presentation with us. I think, is it May time, June time?
Yeah,
We have
it's
another
around May time. Yeah.
presentation. May time, fabulous. Thank you very much. That was a brilliant session. Thank you.